Hello, everybody. My name is Lish or Talisha, as you can see on my thing here. Heather was my mentor during grad school and is now my mentor as I'm doing my LISL certification. So she gets to hear from me a lot. Um, this is probably the first time I've ever presented at a conference like this. So I'd be lying if I said I wasn't feeling a little bit nervous, but that's okay. You guys are a small group, so it's a little less scary. Um, Adam reached out and asked me if I could present a little bit about just telehealth and providing services via Zoom. I know that's something that a lot more families are looking for, especially since COVID. I feel like Zoom therapy and Zoom in general, Zoom meetings, anything virtual has really increased a lot. But unfortunately, a lot of therapists and professionals don't get a lot of training or experience using Zoom until you're kind of thrown into it. So I'm hoping that what I have to share today will be helpful information. Some of it will probably be review for those of you who use Zoom fairly often. But I'm hoping to present some new ideas about how to do Zoom services with some of our little friends that need access to Zoom therapy or Zoom services and live far away. So that's what I'm presenting on today. Just a little bit about me. So, like I said, my name is Talisha. I usually go by Lish. Either is fine. Um, I am originally from Colorado, lived in New Mexico for a while. I went to school in Utah, which is how I got connected with Heather. I did my grad school at Rocky Mountain University in Provo. And I my second semester of grad school is when COVID hit. So I got the benefit, I guess, of being thrown into Zoom therapy at like second semester grad school. And it's something that I've kind of kept up with through some of my other rotations and work experience. So I'm grateful to be able to share what I know today. Um, like I said, Heather was my grad school intern mentor at USDB. After grad school, she actually, well, toward the end of grad school, she emailed me and said, I found you a job. Go back to New Mexico. And I did. I applied for the job and I got it. And happenstance, while I was there, I met my husband and I worked for the New Mexico School for the Deaf. And I feel like I owe all of that to Heather somehow. So thank her for me while she's there. Um, Shortly after I was at the New Mexico School for the Deaf, the St. George Pediatric Rehab reached out to me. I had done an internship with them right before I did an internship with Heather, and they reached out and said, Come back, we have a job for you. So I did. I went back to St. George, worked in the pediatric outpatient clinic there, and loved it. St. George is such a good place, and I loved that clinic. We had a great team. But I took a job at Phoenix Children's Hospital, which is where I am now, specifically to pursue my LISL certification and specialize in working with kids who are deaf and hard of hearing. So that's where I am now. I'm probably a little over a year into my LISL certification with Heather. So I've got a little while to go, but here we are working with all the kids with hearing loss. And right now I probably do maybe 30 to 40% of my sessions on Zoom. So this is good practice for me to share what I have learned in my time here. Um, I want to talk a little bit, just my objectives for what I felt like I wanted to share with you guys about telehealth today. So we want to talk about why we do telehealth, how we set up our telehealth sessions to be successful. I wanted to talk a little bit about benefits to telehealth and also barriers because there are both, obviously, with any, I think with any sort of therapy, anything, there are benefits and barriers. But telehealth is pretty unique in some of the ways that we can use it and also some of the barriers that we face. And then I've also provided some a little bit of training about some of the features that Zoom has to offer. I can show some of those since I'm on Zoom today and use those frequently. And then I have included some resources that I have found to be very, very helpful for the families that I see. Um, and I'd be happy to share those. So let's get going. The first question we want to answer is why would we do telehealth? Why do we not just see kids in person when so much of the time in-person services truly are better? They're better for these little friends, especially for many of you who I understand are working with the birth to three population, and Zoom can be a really challenging platform for those families and those kids. So why might we do telehealth? The first thing is distance, transportation to center. Those are probably the two biggest reasons that I often see kids on Zoom. Um, I think especially when we're working with such a highly specialized population, like kids with hearing loss, they don't live in concentrated areas very often. You know, you can live in a very, very small place and be born with hearing loss and be very far away from the services that you need access to. So that distance from services is often probably the number one reason that we would offer telehealth. Um, Sometimes families just prefer that. It's easier for them to get, come to services consistently when they are on Zoom and be able to be in the comfort of their home, have their own things, and they just prefer that. And then the other one is availability of services. Kind of goes back to that distance to center, where sometimes they live in areas that don't have a lot of services available, or, maybe they have access to a speech therapist, but they may not have access to a teacher of the deaf, or they may not have access to a speech therapist that has any experience working with children with hearing loss. And as we know, there are definitely unique considerations for our population of kids that we see that we should consider. So as I was thinking about this, I came up with a couple of just tips for setting Zoom up for success from a technical standpoint and then from a therapeutic standpoint. And we can talk a little bit more about some of these down the road. Um, on the technical side of things, obviously, the number one thing we need is a reliable, fast internet connection. We've all been on Zoom meetings where the presenter's freezing, the people that are asking questions are freezing. There's really no way to get through that. So a reliable, fast internet connection is a high priority. Ideally, we would have the family be on a computer or tablet, not a phone. Although I will say that more often than not, my families end up using Zoom on the phone and not the tablet or computer. So ideally, that's what we would have, but many families don't have those resources. So a phone can work and does work, but ideally, a computer or tablet is better. Other things to consider, we would love to have great lighting. I know many teachers of the deaf will support spoken language, but also sign language and lighting, video. All of those things are going to be very important for that um, visual access for the signing and even just to see kind of what's happening. Zoom features that I will talk about a little bit later and show when I get to that slide will include like the annotate feature, the whiteboard feature, and screen sharing. I'm obviously screen sharing right now so we can see how that works. You guys can see everything my screen has. And as I get, I've got a slide a little bit later about more of those features, and I will show how to use the annotate and whiteboard features there. From a therapeutic standpoint, the biggest things that I have found to be to set my sessions up for success would be to be coming in prepared. And that's going to be important no matter how we're seeing a family, how we're seeing a child. I've gone into many, many sessions unprepared, and I still do frequently. Sometimes we just don't have the time to prepare the way that we want to. And it is challenging to have everything we want ready to go. But activity preparation for me tends to be the number one thing that I find influences how well my Zoom sessions go. Um, Also positioning a camera, especially for the family, more so than me. When they're on a phone or they're on a small device, sometimes the toddler loves to run around with said phone, and that makes um, the Zoom session a little bit more challenging from the therapeutic standpoint. So having, a good camera positioning, so the family can see us, and then we can also see what's kind of going on in the home. And then removing and limiting distractions. Obviously, when we are not in person with the family, there's very little control we have over what's actually distracting to the client or the family or what's going on in the home. And there's a lot that we can't change about that, but we can encourage families as much as possible to reduce those distractions. How am I doing on time? Okay, we're doing great. So features of Zoom screen sharing, like I said, I'm doing that right now. I do that frequently with my Zoom families, whether that's because I'm, doing watching I use YouTube quite frequently with book recordings. I try not to watch just too many videos with families, but sometimes that is the only way to get a child involved, and so that can be helpful as well. But I'm a big fan of finding children's books read alouds on YouTube and video sharing those so that we are reading, but then you also have the visual component of kind of making that a little bit more engaging and accessible for the child. It is possible when you are on Zoom to give another participant remote control. So we can give a parent or family control over the screen. I like doing this. It's more helpful with older kids, but can be really helpful with parents if they're on a computer. It does not work if they're on a tablet. It does not work if they're on a phone, unfortunately. Um, but if they are on a computer, you can give them remote access to what we're seeing, and give them the ability to move or manipulate things on the screen. So that can be very, very helpful as a feature. The annotate feature, I will show you right here, maybe if it will come up. I'm going to just click right here. I don't know if you can see me clicking on the annotate button, but as you pull up the little taskbar at the top of Zoom, there's a button that says annotate. You can choose your ink color, and then really you can just write anything you want across the screen, which can be very helpful. Um, I've had kids figure out how to do this too, and then I have to clear the screen from what they scribble on my screen, but that can be very helpful. Sometimes I will use that to draw their attention to something specific, or um, I have used this feature many times to do like crossword puzzles with families so they can see what I'm writing, or will draw on a picture or anything like that. So that annotate feature can be pretty fun. Let's see if I can turn that off. Another thing that we can use on here is the whiteboard, which may or may not come up for me right now. Um, Usually there's a little button on here somewhere that will say like to turn on the whiteboard. And that essentially does the same thing as the annotate, except it just makes the whole screen white. In fact, I might not be able to do that because I am screen sharing right now. So you would, it just brings up a blank whiteboard, and you can write on it the same way. So that can be really helpful if we're trying to allow the toddler or the child to kind of scribble or play, have the parents drawing with the child, whatever that looks like. So that whiteboard can be very fun. I like putting, oh, my thing has been moving. I'm so sorry. I didn't even realize my slides were still changing on me. Okay. I like the whiteboard function for also if I'm focusing a lot on parent coaching, I will sometimes turn that whiteboard function on and write our strategies down so that they stay visible for the families to see. The other thing that you can do, which again, I don't know if it will allow me to do it while I screen share because I don't often try to do both at the same time, but you can create a virtual background. So you can go into your Zoom settings, and right now you can tell I'm in my little therapy room. I have my little photo on the wall back here. But if a background is going to be distracting for a child, or you need something that's actually more interesting, you can put a virtual background on the screen. So one of the photos that I just used to do this recently was actually a picture of like a giraffe standing in a field. Um, so we could pretend that we were like in the zoo, you know. I think there's a million photos on Google that we can use for anything. So really the virtual backgrounds are only limited to your own creativity and what you think you might want to kind of use to make that experience a little bit more, what's the word? Immersive, for the child and for the family. Sometimes that's a big challenge of Zoom is feeling so disconnected from the family because you're not in the same room. So something like a virtual background can help make that more fun and more immersive. You can tell Zoom that you have a green screen. That virtual background feature will work better. But if you don't have a green screen, it will still work just fine. I've got a couple of slides here about parent coaching. I put a lot of ideas in both of them. I tried to organize them well. If they are a little bit repetitive, I'm very sorry. These are some of the things that I have found to be very helpful as I coach parents on Zoom. The first thing is that if I have any specific handouts that I was planning on providing for the family, I like to email those ahead of time so that the family can either look at them while we're on Zoom or have them printed or put them on their fridge or whatever they plan on doing with those handouts. I like to give them in advance of the session so that they know kind of what we're talking about. Usually those handouts look like whatever um, language strategy we're going to be focusing on. They might also have activity ideas or homework. So having those things available for the parent to look at while we're talking can be really helpful. Again, I highlighted there that I use that whiteboard function to make the strategies visible for them. I have a physical whiteboard in my office, and I do the same thing here pretty frequently where I will, write up one or two strategies that we're really focusing on, and then we can kind of draw our attention back to that throughout my session. So I like to do the same thing on Zoom just so that it stays visible for the families. And then it becomes easier for them to keep in their brains that that's what we're thinking about while we're talking, while we're playing. I have learned that I'm not perfect at it, and I don't think anybody probably ever will be, but I have learned that one of the biggest things about success with Zoom therapy is helping parents understand their role. And that's true when I'm doing therapy in person or on Zoom, or if I'm just having a conversation with them. I always want them to understand their role with the family, and with their child. But it's especially important on Zoom because I am so much more disconnected. I can be present and I can be there. We can have a conversation, but I definitely cannot do everything for them. So, helping parents understand their role with their child and what I kind of expect them to do during a Zoom session tends to help a lot. Um, I find that quite frequently, even when I'm working with kids that are under 3 years old, that parents often expect to get on Zoom with me and that I'm just going to do something interesting for 50 minutes that keeps the child entertained for an hour. And we know from a lot of experience that kids between the ages of 0 and 3 First of all, do not have great attention spans. Second of all, attend much better to play partners in person than they would on a screen. Many toddlers nowadays are used to seeing people on screens. I mean, my toddler only sees her grandparents on FaceTime for the most part. A few times a year, she might see them all in person, but she has a relationship with them via FaceTime. And unfortunately, that is the reality of our world sometimes, but it is a huge benefit that they have experience with that. That being said, it's still not the most effective way to get them to engage. So I like to help parents understand what I expect from their sessions and the parent involvement. And that can look different depending on the therapist, depending on the rapport with the family, depending on the family's um, abilities and understanding and just kind of their general demeanor with their kids. A lot of that can look very different. So that will probably be very individualized, but that is something that I've found that if I go in and I have different expectations than the parent has, our Zoom sessions are often very disjointed and difficult to complete and feel like they're a really, really good use of our time. So that is really important for me. Um, I really like using an I do, we do, you do coaching model when I'm on Zoom, especially with littles. When it's possible, I try to have some of the same materials that a family might have for their play activities available for me to use. If that's not possible because the family has different toys than I do, or um, just depending on like what my setup is, if I can't do that, I like to kind of talk through what I might do. If I do have the materials available, sometimes I'll just model it for the family. And then we'll kind of all play together. If I have the same toys or similar toys, I might, put them in the screen so that the child can see them while the parent is playing with them as well. And then I'll kind of fade myself out and let the parent take over. And that tends to help the parent feel a little bit more comfortable with using the strategies that we're talking about. Um, I like to understand parent learning styles. Again, this is important no matter how we are coaching parents, whether we're on Zoom or in person. If we don't know how the parent learns, it's going to be much, much harder to coach them into how we want them to be teaching their child these language strategies. Um, and then considerations for child development. Obviously, doing Zoom therapy with a 6-month-old child and their caregivers is going to look very, very different from doing therapy with a child who's almost 3 and going to graduate from early intervention or an older child. So, always taking into consideration like what we would expect of the child developmentally, and using that to set up our sessions. Additional things. Oh, I can wait for that interpreter for just a second. Additional things to consider. I like to plan activities together. Quite often, when I end a Zoom session and I know that I'm going to see the family on Zoom again the next week, I try to use that last few minutes to talk with parents about what we're going to do in the next session. That doesn't mean it has to be perfectly planned or perfectly executed, but just so that I know going into the next week what the parent wants to do for activities, will help us both be a little bit more prepared going in. And then we're not on Zoom the first 5 minutes of the next week being like, well, what are we going to do today? It feels much easier to wrap up our sessions with that plan in mind. But obviously recognizing that anytime you are working with kids or you have families on Zoom, that flexibility is going to be very important too. So being flexible with what those plans look like. Again, these last few strategies are going to be the same whether we're doing coaching in person or on Zoom. But I find them to be almost more important when we're on Zoom because I can't be showing the parent as much as I could when I'm in person. So providing really, really specific feedback for them about what we're seeing, about how they're executing strategies, and helping them, move those activities forward and being able to carry over those strategies into their home, into their everyday activities. So these last three strategies, encouraging carryover, encouraging the use of strategies in everyday activities, and then utilizing both parent coaching strategies and language strategies with the child, um, are going to be critical for using that Zoom session as a way to set them up for the rest of their week, um, and be able to use said strategies at home throughout the week. Some additional considerations. Again, we're going to think about the developmental needs of the child. Seating can be really important. I think a lot of us are reminded of this often, whether we're in person or on Zoom, but having the child, or the parent seated on the side of the child where they might need the most help. So, if they have a hearing aid on one side and a cochlear implant on one side, we're probably going to encourage the parent to sit on the cochlear implant side. If they have a unilateral hearing loss, we're going to have them sit on the side with the hearing loss, to support the use of those devices. Um, and that is just going to give them better access, closer proximity, reducing their listening bubble, all of those things that become really, really important when we're working with children with hearing loss. We always want to be considerate of other things happening in the home. Quite often, the parent and the child that are participating in Zoom therapy are not the only two people in the house. There are often other things going on. So just being aware of that. I like to encourage parents and children to maybe not be isolated necessarily, but if there is a lot going on in the home, to try to separate themselves a little bit so that we reduce those distractions, especially the distractions that are outside of our camera view. There's quite often a lot that we can't see that's going on in the home. I cannot tell you how many times I've ended up on a Zoom session where I cannot seem to get the child to focus on me. And I'm like, what is happening? They're having a hard time paying attention to me. They're having a hard time paying attention to mom, only to find out that the TV's been on in the background the whole time. So the child is paying attention to the screen, even if the sound is off or it's quiet and they can't really hear it. Just having that extra visual distraction can sometimes make a huge, huge difference. So helping parents think about their environment and how to set them up for success with hearing and participating. And then again, we're going to think about phone versus tablet versus computer, how we're set up. If a family is on the phone, I try really hard to encourage them to not let the child take the phone and run with it. It's much harder to rein that back in if it has already happened. Um, and then also having some way to kind of stabilize that device and set it up so it's out of reach of the child, but we can still use that camera. Some of the benefits to telehealth. I actually really like telehealth because I think it kind of forces the family to be a little bit more in charge of their sessions. I think it allows for more parent involvement, which, we all try to use parents and use natural environments. Those of you who go into the homes already have a really good experience with that. That's a challenge for me because I haven't done that setting before. But I like that when you are in the home or when they're in the home and I'm on Zoom, it does allow the parents to be um, more in charge of what the activity looks like, what they're going to do. It kind of pushes them a little bit outside of their comfort zone to use the strategies that we're teaching because I can't just do it for them. Whereas when I'm in person, sometimes families will just tend to sit back. And unless I'm really dragging them in, sometimes it's hard to get them to participate as well. But if they're in charge of, completing activities with the child, it kind of pushes them to use those strategies and try a little bit more. So I like that. It's a really nice benefit of teletherapy. Another benefit, which we've already talked about briefly, is just giving families that live far away or live in rural areas better access to services, even when distance or transportation is a challenge for them. I really like the adaptability and flexibility of Zoom. Sometimes it does feel more limiting in terms of it's a lot harder to play with a 2-year-old on Zoom than it is to play with a 2-year-old in person. But I like that Zoom offers so much flexibility in terms of what the family can do while we're on Zoom with them. It allows them to use maybe everyday activities. I've had many sessions where a family is like folding laundry while we're on Zoom, or they're making lunch while we're on Zoom, and we can use those daily activities to really support what we want the families to be doing and how to use those strategies in the daily routines. Whereas when they come to an in-person session, we might be talking about how to narrate to the child what they're doing in an activity. And I might talk about how to use that during an activity like making lunch with the child. But when they're actually at home making lunch, we can use those strategies much more naturally, which I really, really like. I also like that you can do traditional therapy activities with play and home environment things and daily routines, but you can use the technology in addition to that, which can be really nice depending on what the family wants and needs. Some of the biggest barriers that I have found with telehealth are connecting with families through the computer. Sometimes it is much harder to build rapport with a child that you only see on Zoom, or to have the parents trust you and learn what we want them to pick up on for those language strategies when they can't see me implementing it quite as easily. So that can be a big barrier. Um, Also, technology issues, internet reliability, both of those have been big problems for me. I've been kicked out of many Zoom sessions because of my work internet or because of the family's internet, or they don't have great access. And something is better than nothing for sure, but it can be really challenging to work through a Zoom session with technology issues. Sometimes parent availability can be challenging. I find that sometimes I will see families on Zoom, and while that can be really helpful for those families that live far away, sometimes I feel like I don't see the same caregiver twice ever. And that can be challenging. I've got a family right now a little girl who's about to get her cochlear implants, and her caregivers vary a lot. Mom works, dad works. Mom works in the schools, dad works in the fire department. Sometimes he's gone for like days at a time. So grandparents are often highly involved and aunts are very involved. But that means that sometimes when we see them on Zoom, sometimes we're going to get mom, sometimes we're going to get aunts, sometimes we're going to get maternal grandma, sometimes we're going to get paternal grandma. And when you don't have the same caregiver there consistently, or the same parent available for sessions, it can be hard to continue that carryover with families. And while that does give them better access, sometimes that can be a challenge for us. Um, Again, we're bringing up distractions in the home. They're a big problem sometimes, and helping parents understand how to minimize those is critical. Child engagement can sometimes be tough. And I have a little bit more about this on the next slide as well, but just depending on how well the child is engaging with me or with parent, or how much of a distraction even the Zoom camera can be sometimes, can be a big barrier to the telehealth process. And then the last thing, which is certainly not the least that we want to consider for all of these kids with hearing loss, is that sound access. Zoom has been very smart about how it filters noise. And it naturally is going to take out some of the background noise so that the conversation between participants can be a little bit clearer, but it's not a perfect system. So that being said, that is why sometimes I have no idea that the TV is on in the home because the Zoom filters, Zoom features are naturally filtering out that sound. I'm not getting that TV noise in the background on what I'm hearing because Zoom naturally is going to filter that out. So then sometimes I don't know that that's happening. That being said, it can also be affected with other sounds that we're trying to do. I have done ling sounds with many, many, many kids on Zoom, and they typically can hear an S sound, but when I do them on Zoom, they can't hear anything. And sometimes Zoom just has limitations in how clear sound access can be for kids. Sometimes Zoom will think a sound is extraneous noise and filter it out, and then the family or child cannot hear what we actually do want them to hear. So that can be a challenge. And that's not something we can really change because it's just a Zoom setting. So that's something to consider. Strategies to overcoming these barriers. Again, we're going to go back to having activities planned. Always, 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 if we have activities and backup activities planned and prepared, the family is going to have a better time. They're going to have an easier time keeping their child engaged. Um, and then that's going to make it a lot easier to teach and use strategies because we already have a plan going in. Establishing expectations, I've talked about that a little bit already again before, but just making sure that the family knows what I expect. I know what the family expects, and we're all kind of going into the Zoom session on the same page. If we go in with different expectations, it's very difficult to manage what I'm expecting to see and what they're expecting to see. And then we come out of the session feeling very differently about how it went and what was successful. I always like to have a plan to manage distraction for the child, and this can look like a lot of different things. Sometimes that's going to mean that I do have the child engage with me a little bit more, and we use something like the screen share capabilities where they can see what I see. We can watch a video, we can draw pictures, we can do a lot of things with the Zoom features to allow the child to participate more directly with me. That can also look like we take the camera from Zoom away completely. I've had many parents who will, connect to Zoom, put their phone aside, and put AirPods in their ears so that they can hear what I'm saying to them and also play and talk with their child. And that can be really helpful if my screen becomes distracting for the child. The family can then, the parent can kind of take that away. They can still hear me. I can still coach them. I can still hear what's going on through their microphones, but they can be more present and more engaged with their child. Also, following the child's lead. It's a lot harder on Zoom, but it is still really helpful if we can kind of use what the child is finding interesting. Then we can see that success happen more easily with the Zoom sessions. Parents feel like it's going better, and just being able to follow what the child might want to do. And that goes back to having a plan of what the parent knows the child best. They're already going to have things that they know their child likes, but having a plan that they know their child will enjoy, and then still being able to be flexible if for whatever reason that kid is just not feeling it that day. I don't know how many of you see Zoom kids that are older than 3, but there are some benefits and barriers to Zoom with older kids as well. I do feel like there's better direct engagement with the provider when they're a little bit older. They have flexibility with their school schedules. I really like Zoom when you can isolate an ear in single-sided deafness kids. So I've got a lot of kids with unilateral cochlear implants, and it's really nice to connect them to Zoom, and then I can, stream to only their cochlear implant, and then they're not relying on their better ear to help them, which is a barrier of in-person services with older kids and unilateral hearing loss. So something to keep in mind there. and then benefits of using online activities and resources. Some of the barriers to Zoom therapy with older kids and younger kids is that there's less organic play with the provider because that screen really inhibits that interaction a little bit more. Building rapport can be more difficult. Um, I put less organic play on there twice. That's okay. And then possibly less parent involvement. I feel like when I have older kids on Zoom, I'm much more likely to end up with a parent that just plops their kid in front of the computer or the phone and walks away for 50, 45, 50 minutes and then will come check in with me at the end. And sometimes that can be challenging. I want to spend just a couple of minutes on kind of setting up our session. So just like any session we set up, we're going to want more or less of a schedule. I always like to check in, review our plan from the previous week, talk about what materials the parent might be using in that session so that I can, pull out matching materials if I have something or give them ideas about what to do. Discuss the goal of the session, what strategy we're going to be focusing on, vocabulary we might want to target, grammar structures we might want to be targeting, those kinds of things. Obviously, completing the activities and providing feedback to the parents. I wrote repeat steps 6 and 7. I definitely meant 5 and 6, but just, activity, feedback, kind of giving that as much attention as the child needs. Some kids will maybe do 1 or 2 activities in a session, and some might need a lot more than that. And then we're going to end again with a plan for the next session so that we all go in prepared. Um, I really like to think about themed activities. If I'm doing a session on Zoom, sometimes it's a lot easier if I have a theme that I'm kind of sticking to. We can choose a book and an activity kind of around that general theme. And sometimes that makes it a lot easier to streamline things like vocabulary, makes it more engaging. They know what to expect, and that can be nice. You can still incorporate books, songs, play, just like an in-person session. It just has to be a little bit more thought out, a little bit more intentional. And then I always like to establish, target vocabulary, grammar, auditory targets ahead of the session. And then I always like to, if I know what the parent is planning for the session, then I can come in with additional ideas to offer the parent in real time about how to use or change or adjust, the language models we're using or the strategies we're using. I'm also a big fan of Pinterest and ChatGPT and all of the AI things that are available to us to plan activities for us. I have ChatGPT plan activities for me quite often, and that can be helpful for the family as well. Sometimes it's just really challenging for families or providers to come up with unique ideas about what might be interesting to the child. And so pulling out all of the stops for using the resources that are available to us to find those activities can be really, really helpful. And then take a little bit of the mental load off of the parent. All they have to do is prep the activity and show up. And then my job is to help them use the LISL strategies or ASL strategies if the family is primarily signing to be able to use those strategies with the activities that have been prepared for them. If necessary, the therapist or the teacher of the deaf can fully prepare this session and provide scripting for parents. I don't find that I do that very often, but I have given parents very specific recommendations about what to do during a session. I'm a big fan of repeating activities. I think the more a child sees something and hears something, the more efficiently they're going to learn it. So don't be afraid to do the same activities, multiple weeks in a row, or do an activity and then repeat it 3 or 4 weeks later. I also really like just joining the family for what they're already doing. That goes back to that folding laundry, making lunch, playing with their toys, whatever they're already doing. It is so easy when you're on a Zoom session to just join them and jump in and be able to kind of observe what's already happening there. Some of the other things I like to consider is that once in a while, it is nice to be able to have the child just be able to go run and do their own thing and play with their own toys and have some time to just be a kid and have a conversation with just the parent without the child in the room. Obviously, most of the time, we're going to have parent and child together during those sessions, but there have been times when I have done portions of a session with only the parent, and that can be easier when you are on Zoom, and they can be, the kid can kind of be off doing their own thing, and the parent can just have a minute to talk with the provider, which is much harder in a therapy room. I have included some resources here. These are some of my favorite things to use with Zoom sessions. If you don't already know about the Cochlear Sound Foundations for Babies and Toddlers, they both have I want to say 40 weeks of activities and ideas of what to do with babies and toddlers to help them learn auditory skills, expressive language skills, receptive language skills, and speech skills. And each week recommends a book and a song to teach the child. So those can be really helpful when you're going back to, okay, what are we going to do? Either you can pull out those activities and recommend them to the family. And I've also used them as homework too. So if you don't already know about those are great resources to have. I use YouTube a lot, books especially. Hearing First has some great resources. They have a telepractice checklist, which can be helpful. And then there's this creating listening opportunities in um, everyday activities, I think is what it's called. And it is a really, really nice form that I have filled out on Zoom with many families where we talk about a routine that they do every day in their home. And we can use specific strategies and think through all of the language targets that they want to use. And that can automatically turn into, I pull it up on Zoom, I fill it out, I type everything in, and then I email it to the family at the end of the session, and then they have it as the resource. Some of the other ones that I use, online games can be helpful, boom cards can be helpful. Sometimes I like to do virtual field trips with the kids. San Diego Zoo has some cameras that you can see the animals from, and so sometimes it's fun to take the kids to the zoo when you're on Zoom and they can see what's going on in their environment. So you can find some other opportunities like that, or use your virtual backgrounds to kind of create you know, that immersive experience for the child. And then always using the home environment can be really helpful. All of you who go into the homes already have that benefit, and some of you are already going to be aware of what the family might have in the home to use. But that can be a real benefit for someone like me who works in a clinic and doesn't see the home very often, being able to see what the family does at home. Okay, that is it. I have a few more minutes, couple. I did not think I was going to use that much time, but I would love to be able to answer any questions if anybody has some.
We do have a question regarding online games. So is there a way you can give the child control so that they can click or they can touch the screen? And how do you do that?
Yes. So, like I said a little while ago, it's not possible if they're on a phone. Usually, if they're on a phone, I end up kind of taking their turn for them, and it's a little bit less rewarding that way for sure. Um, but if they are on a computer or tablet, there is a little button at the top of the little uh, toolbar at the top that just says remote control. And then you can choose. So, I could go through anybody that's on this list right now on our Zoom thing, and I could give Elise Farnsworth remote control right now if I wanted to. And then you can just if there's just you and the parent, it should pop up the parent or child, whoever they have the name listed under. It should pop them up and you can give them remote access to the mouse, and then they can choose choose the buttons and control that.
So
I don't know.
even though you're sharing a screen, sharing the
You
online
could, yeah.
screen,
I don't think Yeah, they're still going. We have a few minutes.
Yeah, we can tell her that she's talking. I can't mute it. Melissa, your mic is on. So my question is, as long as they have you give them the remote control, even though it's through a shared screen, they can still touch the screen.
Yes. Yes, they can.
That's so good to know.
All right. Anybody else?
That was wonderful.
All right, Lish. Thank you so much, Lish.
Yeah, of course.